Welcome everyone. On behalf of CUTA, I'm just pleased to thank all of you for joining us on the launch of the Integrated Mobility Toolbox and this webinar that will introduce you to many elements of it. It's long awaited, and I'm really excited to be able to be here today and be part of it with you. CUTA adopted a new vision a number of years ago to inspire and influence the evolution of integrated urban mobility. And many of us on this call, many of our members, those of us in the industry, we're paused to consider, what does this journey mean? What is integrated urban mobility? And what is transit's role in this? How do we play a part? And I've had the pleasure to walk alongside an amazing cohort of members, industry players and stakeholders over the last number of years as we've explored what this means for transit, what it means for mobility in our communities in Canada, and how we can play a role in this. Through that journey, it was evident that our members were keen to pick up on this role and wanted to not only influence it, but know better how they might be able to affect it within their own communities. And that's really led to the development of this toolbox, a suite of tools and resources to help communities, help transit systems consider solutions within their own communities. So it's an absolute pleasure that we're able to launch this with all of you today. A good many of you were part of the journey, part of the contents of this toolbox. And for many on the call, either those presenting or those listening in fact, for many it was a labor of love, not just our work and vision putting this together. There's a few groups I'd like to acknowledge before we get started on the webinar. And the first is CUTA's Urban Mobility Task Force and its predecessor, the Integrated Mobility Task Force. Their work coming together as members across the country and working alongside Dillon Consulting in developing this toolbox is something that I would like to acknowledge with everyone here today. This group was led by Laurent Chavreau, along with some of our teammates here at CUTA, and I would like to thank them very much for their work, efforts and diligence, perseverance in putting this together. And then it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today from Dillon Consulting. They've been spearheading work on this toolbox. We have joining with us a good friend, a long-term colleague from Dillon, in many ways, Sean Rathwell, and his colleague Kaya Saber, who have worked alongside the task force on this toolbox. Sean's been involved in the Canadian transit industry for over 30 years. He's a former manager of service planning for OC Transco in Ottawa. And since joining the consulting world 17 years ago, he's worked on transit policy, strategy, planning assignments throughout Canada, as well as the US, Australia, and a number of other countries. Sean's very active at CUTA. Many of you will know him. He's a facilitator for one of our transit planning courses here at CUTA. He's also vice chair of business members on CUTA's executive committee. Kaya is with Dillon as a transportation planner, and she brings a particular experience in transit policy and planning, both for conventional and specialized transit, project evaluation, evidence-based analysis, and alternative service delivery models, all very important elements of the work we're talking about today, and a specific interest in the role of transportation in building sustainable, resilient, and livable cities. So with that, I'd like again to thank everyone for joining us today, and I'm going to turn the rest of the webinar over to Sean and Kaya. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you, Wendy, and hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. We're going to talk to you a little bit about the CUTA Integrated Mobility Implementation Toolbox. And we want to talk first about why we're talking about a toolbox, I guess. And it really comes down to one word, and that word is change. Over the last 100 years, we've been driving, taking transit, riding bicycles, walking to work, whatever, to make urban journeys. And really, there hasn't been a lot of change over most of that period until the last decade or so, when a whole lot of things started to change. Consider what has changed. First of all, you've got travel behavior. We see millennials, the millennial generation, some of them getting their driver's licenses much later than typical, and when they do, they don't often drive as much. And that's reflected in changes to vehicle miles traveled or vehicle kilometers traveled, not just here in Canada, but in the US, Australia, and parts of Europe as well. Over the last decade, we've seen total vehicle miles traveled, that blue line on the chart, sort of taper off and level off and even decline a touch for the first time in 100 years. And per capita VMT, or the amount that each of us drives on average in a year, has declined quite a bit. That's been a surprise. So things are changing with travel behavior. We've also seen the introduction of mobile technology in this time period. Think about the iPhone was introduced just about a month over 10 years ago. And the first Android device, mobile Android device, is only 9 years old this month. That's not a lot of time, given how these devices and the technology has changed the way we approach our lives. We certainly think differently and go about doing the things we do every day differently, and that's affected transportation as well. And mobile technology has driven the introduction of a variety of new approaches to the way we move about cities. You know, we're most of us familiar with Uber and Lyft as well, and microtransit, Bikeshare, different approaches. Even you know, well, the car share industry has been around for longer than a decade. I think it's fair to say that mobile technology has been able to enhance it and make those systems and services far easier and accessible for more people. But it's more than just new services available. It's also new approaches to the infrastructure, and particularly I'm thinking of complete streets here, and how that concept has really taken hold in North America, particularly, and certainly here in Canada. Designing streets for all road users. Almost every major urban community now has a complete streets policy. They think about their streets from the user's perspective now instead of from the car's perspective. So that's a good thing. And of course, the big thing that's really started changing in the last couple of years is autonomous vehicles. And this is going to potentially change everything that's already been changing, and start thinking of new approaches. We're starting to see, we're continuing to see lots of press about new advancements by all kinds of different car companies, not just, or I should say all companies, not just car companies. You know, Google started, was one of the early ones in there, and I was just reading yesterday that the people that make Dyson vacuums are looking at electric cars and potentially autonomous cars as a product of theirs down the road in the future. So things are really changing. And what's, we need to sort of think about what happens with all of these trends. And on the next slide, we talk about just what is changing, and all these things come together and make us look for a better future for mobility, really. We need to understand these trends and what they're going to mean in all aspects of our life, from social to technical, environmental, and the whole picture there. And what we really want is a more intelligent approach about providing transportation services that meet all users' needs. When you put all those things together, that's really what integrated mobility is all about. And that's why CUTA undertook a change in their approach to their business a few years ago, changed their vision, and now focus on trying to inspire and influence the evolution of integrated mobility. And Wendy mentioned the task force that has been working on this topic. That task force was the one that led or identified the need for the toolbox. And the toolbox, you just saw it flash up there, is what has been developed now. And there's 7 key chapters to it, and we're going to explore each of those chapters with you in the remaining part of this presentation. We'll talk first about what is integrated mobility and what it means. Understanding the state of our industry, our transit industry and the mobility industry is really important in order to really understand why we need to be looking at this approach. We've got some information on how you use the toolbox, and then we focused a lot of inspirational ideas into 3 primary chapters, which we'll explain in a moment: design for movement, demand management, and mobility management. And then the toolbox structure finishes off with what communities and transit systems can do to move forward and advance the ideas of integrated mobility in their own communities. So what is integrated mobility? It's defined by CUTA as the ability for people to move easily from place to place according to their own needs. That's a pretty broad statement, but I think it's important to note that it's not focused on transit, it's not focused on modes or vehicles, it's focused on people being able to do their own thing and live their own life. But it's a very broad statement, so you need to think about it a little bit more. And from CUTA's perspective, integrated mobility is very much a people-focused goal that starts with public transport connected to all modes of transport. It enables door-to-door and seamless mobility and is designed for all segments of the population, all users. So those words are highlighted there for a reason. All modes for all users in a seamless way. You can express that graphically, a little bubble diagram on the next slide here. So integrated mobility is about, as I said, all users being able to access all modes in a seamless way. But how do you make that happen? You need to think in an integrated way. Thus, the term integrated thinking is brought into the lexicon here. And in the toolbox, we have focused integrated thinking into 3 primary themes or areas of discussion, if you will. The first is demand management. And by that, we're referring to the understanding, forecasting, and influencing of travel demand by focusing on the user. Now, influencing travel demand is sort of the traditional part of travel demand management or transportation demand management, TDM. And that's a very key element of the whole integrated thinking and integrated mobility approach. But so also is understanding and forecasting that demand. So really understanding the user and being able to, look ahead and figure out how people are going to behave and how they're going to travel. Very challenging. The second element is mobility management. And by that, we're referring to the coordination and optimization of all modes of transportation to ease travel in urban areas. So this is about all the modes coming together and having a way for the user to easily access them and move between them and that sort of thing. So mobility management is really the supply side of the equation, supplying the transportation service. Demand management is where the users are and being able to deal with that, so the demand side of the equation. But in order to make the two work together, you need something between them, and that we're calling design for movement, the third element. And this we mean by the planning and design of land use, places, streets, and infrastructure in a seamless and integrated way for all modes and all users. So think of this as the glue that allows the users to move about on whatever mode they want within a community. And yes, it is a complete street, perhaps, but it's also great urban design. It's about developing and planning the land use in a thinking about it in a multimodal way, creating great communities that are going to be accessible for all users, and being able to move about that system in a very seamless way. It's where the ITS, Intelligent Transportation Systems elements bring to it. So that's what agencies are looking at in the future, a way to move towards integrated mobility by thinking of these things. But it all focuses on the user. And the next slide shows very much a complicated looking little drawing. It is, just to explain it here, you'll see across the middle some darker blue squares: trip origin, plan the trip, walk to the trip start. These are the various steps along a particular user's journey on a trip. And at each point in that journey, the user has several options. These are the purple boxes to the bottom. They could walk, they could bike, they could take transit. They, you know, in terms of planning their journey, they could use an app, they could make a phone call. There's different ways that you can do all these things. There's a lot of options at each different step that the user has to understand. There's a lot of things that influence that. And as our little happy-faced user there goes along his journey, he's making different choices and interpreting different things. So the teal-related boxes above the blue boxes are the experiences that the user has had and how they perceive the different options that they have available to them. The green boxes are those external influencers that agencies like transit systems and local governments can influence as they help that user make the right choice for their trip. So this is very much the user's perspective of transportation and how they make an individual journey. There's an amazing number of boxes on that square, on that slide. And so that just tells us just how complicated it really is and why it's so important for us to really understand what the user is interested in as they make their journeys and plan their journeys through our cities. So let's do an example here of a more practical example than drawing a little picture like that on a bunch of boxes. A day in the life or a trip in the life of, let's say, Wendy, who introduced our webinar. You know, she's getting up in the morning and she's got to go to a different place than her normal workplace and going to a meeting. So the first thing she's going to do is open up her smartphone and type in or tap her mobility provider's app. And she'll get information. She'll enter in, I'm going here, I'm at home now, I'm going here. I need to know how to get there, and the information will be provided. It won't just be how to get there on transit. It will provide information on how long it might take to drive, how long it might take to transit, different options for those. It'll bring in the option of using a transportation network company like Uber or a car share or a bike share. It might give her information about greenhouse gas emissions, that the different options might, everything focused around what Wendy's needs and interests are and what she's prepared to do as she travels about on her daily business. She's going to use all of that information to pick an option. And let's say she picks an option to order up a transportation network car, a rideshare car, to take her over to an LRT station, where she'll get on the LRT and then travel along 10 stations or so to get to another station where she'll get off, maybe take a BRT up to her meeting location. So she walks straight onto the platform. She doesn't have to, pay a special fare because the mobility provider allows for the fare payment and knows where she's getting on and getting off the vehicle and that sort of thing. So Wendy's on her journey there and on the train, enjoying things, researching her CUTA's position for the meeting that's coming up. And she gets a bit of a text message, a verbal text message through the headphones that she's got on, listening to some great music. And it says something simple like, there's a track delay between stations 6 and 7 up ahead. It's going to add 15 minutes to your journey. Would you like options to avoid this? Well, Wendy knows that if she takes 15 minutes extra to get there, she might be late, doesn't want to be late for this meeting. So she hits yes on her smartphone that she wants some options, and it gives her some options and identifies a station 5 that there's a car share vehicle available that she can access. So it automatically, she says yes. So she reserves that car share vehicle, gets off at station 5, and the car share vehicle is sitting there waiting for her. She walks up to the car share vehicle, waves her smartphone in front of the lock or whatever, the reader, and it unlocks the car for her. She gets in, she puts her phone in the holster, and directions to where she's going to be going immediately come up because her mobility provider knows where she's trying to head. And she starts following those directions, working very easily. The next step on her journey is she gets another verbal text message from the mobility provider, and it's telling her that a courier company has contacted the mobility provider and wants to know where Wendy would like a package delivered. So the choices are home, office, or car. Now, Wendy is not going to be in the office today and isn't at home to accept the delivery, but her car is in the driveway because she chose to not use it today. So she chooses car, and the mobility provider then directs the courier company to her car, unlocks the car trunk. The fellow puts the parcels in the trunk, closes the trunk, and then Wendy gets a message back that the parcel's been delivered at some point later that day. So another little message from the mobility provider. Wendy wants to know if Wendy wants to park the vehicle. Will she need it later, or does she want to drop it at one of the car share parking spots? She says that she wants to keep it, and because she needs to get back onto another meeting, move along. So she wants to park it and use it later. So the mobility provider directs her through instructions on her phone screen to the nearest available parking space, to where she's heading, whether it's an on-street, in a parking lot, in a parking garage, and it'll be one that will minimize her parking cost, and she'll only be, because she's a member of this mobility system, would only be paying parking for up to the nearest minute, as opposed to rounding up to the nearest half hour or something like that. So Wendy parks the car, gets out, carries on down the sidewalk towards her the building where her meeting is. Her phone pings, she looks at her phone, and there's a coupon from the mobility provider for some coffee at a coffee shop that's on her way to the building, just to thank her for taking some sustainable modes as she goes. So you get the idea of what life might be like in the future, and you throw in things like autonomous vehicles into this. You're seeing, you know, an easy way for people to move out of city using multiple modes, incentives for them to keep doing so. It's going to be an interesting future down the road. And I'm going to hand it off to Kaya now to continue telling you more about the toolbox.
Thanks, Sean. So as Sean mentioned, it's sure to be a very interesting future, and this toolbox is meant to provide both information and inspiration on all of the possibilities that could appear in the future. It's meant to help not only transit agencies, but also municipalities and other mobility actors in things like designing complete streets for all modes of mobility and all users of all abilities. It's meant to help in coordinating between various mobility actors to find solutions that capitalize on each of their strengths. Perhaps helping in organizing municipal departments differently to encourage more collaboration, or maybe partnering with external organizations to foster innovation. It's meant to help in providing solutions that meet users' needs and ultimately influencing the way we think about planning and designing and using our own transportation systems. So why is this happening all now? Why has this toolbox been created? In short, transit is going through a bit of a transition, and Sean alluded to that earlier with noting many issues that are changing currently. And CUTA's Transit Vision 2040 also identified a number of elements of change. For example, despite fluctuations over the past few years, transit ridership has been steadily growing over the past several years for a wide variety of reasons. Mobility hubs have become building blocks of municipal and regional planning. Transit agencies are becoming more and more customer focused. We're seeing passenger charters become more common as transit agencies look to make meaningful promises to their customers. At the same time, operating costs continue to rise, particularly fuel and labor. Technology is having significant and widespread impacts. New data collection techniques, personal smartphones, and open data, these are all changing the landscape significantly. Similarly, the sharing economy has been transformational. Car sharing, ride sharing, and crowdsourcing have created an environment that transit agencies had not anticipated and to which they have necessarily not yet become acclimatized. Accessibility is mainstream, and transit agencies continue to make strides towards making their systems usable for all users of all abilities. Interregional travel has become more prevalent and critical, and regional transit governance structures have arisen in Canada's mega regions. New funding sources are appearing, both governmental and from new strategies like land value capture. Continued population and employment growth in suburban areas has created increased expectations for transit use in suburban environments, which are typically transit unfriendly, and these are often a good candidate for alternative service delivery models. New mobility managers are emerging, and as one example, many car companies have acquired mobility management enterprises. For example, Daimler is the parent company of Ride Scout, Car2Go, and Movil. And lastly, the 9-to-5 workday is no more. People don't work the same way they used to, and commuting behavior has not necessarily shortened, but it's changed. So these are all parameters that are being felt right now as we look around. But as we look forward, there's a few more changes to come. Environmental regulations are becoming more strict. Demographics are trending towards transit dependence, particularly in Canada with our aging population. As communities adopt transit earlier, transit systems must be flexible and adaptive enough to grow and change their communities. Individuality is becoming more important. Users want to travel in the way that's most comfortable and convenient to them. And responding to this is mobility as a service models, which cater to individual needs and preferences for travel. And lastly, as Sean mentioned earlier, autonomous vehicles may soon be mainstream, and these will have significant and yet to be fully understood impacts. So taking a step back from all this, there's a lot changing right now, and there's a lot that will continue to change in the future. And doing things in the same way is just not going to work anymore. So transit's at a bit of a fork in the tracks, if you will. On one hand, there's the conventional typical model of modal isolation. And on the other hand, there's a newer model that's more innovative that capitalizes on the capabilities of each mode and each mobility partner. And so this toolbox, as I mentioned, is intended to assist all mobility partners in identifying opportunities to work towards this new model. One strategy for this is design for movement. This is one of the 3 themes that Sean spoke about a few minutes ago. This encompasses the planning and design of our communities, their land use, places, streets, infrastructure, and technology in a seamless and integrated way for all modes and all users. Design for movement is the built form strategy, if you will. It can include initiatives related to planning and land use. So this could be as simple as conducting a holistic and multimodal review of the impact of new developments on every mode, instead of a more traditional traffic impact study. Or it could be as comprehensive as creating an integrated mobility plan in place of the more traditional transportation master plan. Complete Streets, which we're all very familiar with, provides a variety of options for working towards integrated mobility, and intelligent transportation systems are critical to achieving seamless movement both within and between modes. As an example of a strategy that would fit under design for movement is the Sherbrooke Sustainable Mobility Plan. And this was created by the Sherbrooke Sustainable Mobility Centre, which is a joint venture between the City of Sherbrooke and the Société de Transport de Sherbrooke. It contains 33 action items which work towards achieving the sustainable mobility vision of the city's master plan. So here's 2 major planning documents that are working together to achieve integrated mobility. These 33 action items are grouped into 7 themes, and you'll notice that these 7 themes listed on the slides are all key components and actors in integrated mobility. So this is just one example of a design for movement strategy, and there are many others included in the toolbox. Demand management is a more user-focused strategy for integrated mobility. It aims to understand, forecast, and influence travel demand by considering each user's mobility needs, reasons, and preferences, and seeks to either change these behaviors to more sustainable modes or adapt the system to better accommodate them. Demand management could include pricing policies and incentives to incentivize transit use or other sustainable modes. It could include smart travel programs offered at a regional, municipal, community, or organization level, or it could include education and outreach, focused on widening the understanding of sustainable forms of mobility and providing users the tools they need to make best use of the system. As an interesting example of this, and a perfect example of how technology has expanded opportunities, Capital Bikeshare allows users to provide input into the municipal bikeshare system. So Capital Bikeshare is, as you may have guessed, a bikeshare company currently operating in Virginia, DC, and Maryland, only in certain cities within those states. And they provide an interactive online map for their users to tailor the system to better suit their needs. On the map, users can propose new locations. They can support locations proposed by others. They can also add comments about why they like or don't like a certain location. What's interesting is the map also shows pending and approved locations. so that users can see when their suggestions and the suggestions of others have come to fruition, which is very rewarding. So we'll go to the site now quickly to see what it looks like. As you can see, you have to log in, but once you make a username, up comes the map. And you'll see in these red squares with the little yellow line work, those are existing Bikeshare locations. And these little green dots that sort of look like balloons are community suggested locations. You'll notice for here in this location, for example, there's about 40 people who have suggested a new Bikeshare station is needed in this area. And if we zoom in, we can see in greater detail that, for example, about 7 people would like a Bikeshare station at one corner, about 8 would like one at another. So it provides a lot of user input at a very detailed level. And it's very rewarding for users to be able to influence the system that they use and ultimately benefit from. We'll move on to the third strategy of integrated mobility, which is mobility management. And this is the coordination and optimization of all modes of transportation to enable ease of travel for all users. Ultimately, this is the lens of integrated mobility that is focused on collaboration and cooperation. It encourages partnerships with actors who, in traditional terms, may have been labeled as disruptive forces or disruptive technologies. We've heard a lot of this language being thrown around in the previous years. But I'd argue that instead of labeling these as disruptive technologies, we label them instead as transformational technologies, for there's great opportunity for collaboration and cooperation with these organizations to further integrated mobility. So such partnerships could include partnerships with car share services. These could involve integrated smart cards to pay for transit and car share together with one smart card. It could also include better integration between car share stations and bike facilities just to make that transfer between modes easier. TNC and taxi partnerships could be used to solve the first mile, last mile dilemma or to replace service in low demand areas or times, as an example. Partnerships with van pool, carpool, and ride-sharing services could see preferential parking or mobile app integration for finding that carpool ride more easily. Furthermore, partnerships with bike-share enterprises could see increased integration with transit or simply more bike-friendly transit policies. Microtransit services could be used in the first and last mile to serve specific areas or as a form of community transportation. And lastly, mobility as a service models are forward-thinking models that allow users to get the most out of their transportation network. So for example, I currently have a transit pass, I have 2 car share memberships, I rent cars often with a different enterprise, I use Uber much too often, and I use Bikeshare occasionally. That's 6 different accounts and different providers that I have to deal with to get around. And they're all completely separate. Under a mobility as a service model, I would have just one account with one mobility provider, and I'd be able to use an integrated platform to plan, book, and pay for all of these different types of trips. An example of this is Smile in Vienna, Austria. And this was one of the world's first mobility as a service pilot projects. It ran from 2014 to 2015. It allowed users to plan, reserve, and pay for multimodal trips using one app. Additionally, users could save their preferences and information in their profiles, such as maximum walking distance or their car share membership number. And as you can see from the numbers on the screen, the results were very successful and showed a shift towards sustainable modes. 3/4 were satisfied and about half took public transit more often. 21% drove their personal car less often, about 1/4 combined car and public transit more often, and about 1/5 combined public transit and bike more often. So these results indicate that when the planning, booking, and payment of multimodal trips is simplified, users may be more open to shifting towards more sustainable modes to make their trip in the most efficient and sustainable way. So here we've highlighted just a few of the examples that are presented in the toolbox, intended to give an idea of the various options that are available. The toolbox also provides indication of the relative level of transit agency involvement required for each of these options. Regardless of which option is pursued, when we spoke with various municipalities who have worked towards implementing some of these options and working towards integrated mobility, we heard some common and notable recommendations to keep in mind when moving forward, and I'm going to pass it back to Sean to discuss those.
Well, thank you, Kaya. Moving forward, some of the keys to success that we learned in talking with so many of the agencies and businesses that have brought these examples forward. You know, the first one is kind of obvious. Focus on the user. It's people moving about their lives that for their lifestyles that is why transportation is needed. Transportation doesn't exist for its own sake. So we've got to make sure that we're focused on those users' requirements. And of course, if you're going to do something, you've got to understand what the goals and objectives of it are. Really try to be innovative. That can be hard for a lot of organizations that have done things a certain way or are focused on an individual mode or what have you, but that's really important to encourage that innovation and think broadly. Create true partnerships where you're working equally. Don't dictate to the other fellow that this is what you're going to do and this is how you shall do it, otherwise go away. You need to work together. Communication is obviously important between the partners, with the users, to get information out, to make sure that everybody knows how to use what you're doing and how effective it can be. Don't be afraid of pilot projects. There's some excellent examples of pilot projects that have taught the people that set them up a lot of things and how to improve the next time they try to do something. I'm thinking particularly of Milton and Metrolinx working together on the Go Connect app-based system to access Go stations through private transit a year or so ago. Think seamlessly. Make it as easy as possible to avoid the 6 different membership numbers and things that Kaya has in order to move about where she lives, and make it easy to get your information, pay for what you're doing, make it one place. And persist was the things that people kept saying. There's going to be lots of naysayers as you're trying to build these partnerships, people that aren't necessarily looking forward to the future, and it's important to find your way around those and keep moving. Finally, you're probably interested in, it sounds really interesting. It's a great sounding toolbox. Where do you get it? Well, it's on CUTA's website today. In go onto the main page under the resources tab. I'm just calling it up there, and you get this page right here, which has a little bit of information from the toolbox about integrated mobility, a letter from the chair of the task force, Laurent Chevreau, and some other information, and a couple of spots where you can access the toolbox itself and download the report. We're looking at the English version. The French part of CUTA's website has the same information and access to a French version of the report as well. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time. Kaya and I will be delighted to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Sean and Kaya, for that really informative walkthrough up to the development of the toolbox and also the contents of the toolbox. Before we get into the Q&As that many of you might have, I just wanted to thank everyone again for your interest in this topic and joining us today. This is one of many steps on our industry's roadmap to integrated urban mobility, and it's a really exciting turning point from talking about it as a vision to actually producing some tools and resources to think about how we can adopt this approach in our individual communities. So I'm really excited to see where this toolbox might lead your individual communities. At CUTA, we stand ready to answer your questions beyond this webinar. Calvin's brought up an email there that can be used by any of you if you have any follow-on questions about where to get this resource, how to interpret it, how do you connect with others that might be using this. We expect that there'll be a wide and varied range of follow-on questions and inquiries, and we'll funnel that through this address and connect you with resources and others that are looking to do this as well. So thank you again. I look forward to hearing where your paths take you.